we may be getting fixated on these slight differences between a state policy lead or a federal policy lead, when in reality, it's just better to have somebody lead, right? The economists can tell you what makes sense, economically, but if there's just political issues going on, then that may be the last hurdle that the economist hasn't figured out how to get over yet.
Are we?
Yes.
Where are we?
Here.
Why are we here? Not entirely clear. We are misfits thrust into existence by random chance, with no hints at all as to how we're supposed to make sense of it all. It's immensely bizarre. Here we are.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Here We Are podcast. I'm Shane Mauss. We have a fantastic guest, another guest from the University of Tennessee, kind of sponsored by the One Health Initiative, all about kind of getting information out to the public about One Health policies and all of the interdisciplinary efforts between so many different fields to talk about the intersection of humans and animals and the environment and zoonosis and biodiversity loss and all of these topics that we've been sharing about once a month or so through much of this year. And so we've been getting a lot of great feedback on these episodes. I'm glad you're enjoying them. And my guest today is Charles Sims. Charles, can you introduce yourself to the good people listening?
Yeah, hi, everybody. Charles Sims. I'm an economist by training, so I have an appointment at the economics department at the University of Tennessee. And I also have another appointment in the Baker Center for Public Policy, where I spend a lot of my time taking my economic toolbox and applying it to public policy questions, some of which are about One Health, and then some of which are about other issues related to energy or climate change and things like that.
So how did you get involved in this in the first place? Because this is as we've been having different people in different fields. This is definitely a novel one as you kind of research a lot of the sorting out the economics of a lot of the cost benefit analysis of different policies and effectiveness in terms of environmental issues, right?
Yeah, so I got into this really in my PhD. So I went to the University of Wyoming, and the folks at the University of Wyoming do a lot of these things. They're usually trying to apply economics to questions about invasive species or disease control and things like this. So I came in thinking that as an economist, my job was just to sort of put dollar values on things. That's what I had been taught for the longest time. But when I got there, they kind of opened my eyes a little bit and showed me, what economists should be doing is kind of interacting with ecologists and epidemiologists and trying to integrate the models that we use to talk about how people make decisions in economic settings, and then try to pair them up with some of these models that talk about how the ecosystem changes and how diseases spread and how invasive species move across a landscape. And that's really another important facet of what we do. And I got super into that just because I'm one of those people that has books about different things on my nightstand. Since I just enjoy tell me what's the 101 type basic undergraduate textbook on whatever it is you're talking about, and I want to go read about it. So it worked out perfect for me.
Kindred spirits. That's exactly. I mean, not that you certainly do have expertise, but personally, I spend for this podcast, I just spend the majority of my time trying to learn the 101 in as many different fields as possible. And I also, it's just that's where kind of my level of interest is as well, where especially as a science communicator, I feel like there's sometimes diminishing returns for me in reading like a fifth book on the same-ish subject, even though I will still learn more. Whereas going from 0 to 101 understanding of a subject is just kind of more of a change.
Yeah, experts are not always the best communicators, so.
Yeah. So cool. We'll talk about what's some of your work at the University of Tennessee that you're doing.
So some of my work that's in this One Health area is kind of related to how markets for different agricultural commodities are spreading invasive species or spreading wildlife diseases. So we've been doing some work in Yellowstone around brucellosis and chronic wasting disease in the elk herds up there, and really trying to model.
I'm in Wisconsin, and so there's been a lot of talk of it in the news in the deer populations here over the last month or so. So sorry to interrupt, but
no. It's all over the place. Subject. It's here in Tennessee too, for sure. We had just started working up there because it seemed it was moving out there earlier, and then there were some interesting questions about ranching that was interacting with the diseases. So we've been working on that. We've been doing some projects on that in the past, but also doing some projects on just basic disease spread, human health disease spread, that started up kind of after COVID, kind of like everybody else. We got interested in COVID because you're sitting around locked up in your house and it's the one thing that's on your mind, right? So we worked with some epidemiologists to think about kind of what's the optimal level to set public health policy. And is it better at the local level or the state level or the federal level? And this kind of all goes back to a classic econ literature where they're trying to figure out where's the best place to manage environmental policy. So should environmental policy be set at the federal level or the state level or the local level? So we were looking at that for public health. What are the similar trade-offs there as well? And then beyond the One Health stuff, we're working on things related to energy, kind of looking at the incentives for firms to shut down coal-fired plants and looking at how to manage endangered species with climate change that's starting to shift their territories around and things like that. So I mean, economics is a nice field for me because people perceive it as economists think they know something about everything, but it's really just economics bleeds into almost everything, right? And so you can take your economic toolbox and analyze a bunch of different things. So I'm not one of these researchers who kind of hones in and studies this one plant or this one ecosystem. A little schizophrenic, I guess, and then I bounce all over the place and study a lot of different things. Yeah.
So, I would love to hear about some of the work on COVID, simply because I'm sure there's a lot of listeners that, not on this show, but I mean, we have a COVID episode like every 2 months or so. I wouldn't say that. I mean, I bring it up more often than that, but I'm not covering it on every episode or anything, but it really is I've found that it's a nice way to demonstrate just how many different variables and considerations and fields of research that all go into this same basic crisis that we're all dealing with and trying to sort out. And as much as maybe if you get all of your information about COVID from the 24/7 cable news or something, it probably seems pretty redundant and you've heard all of the same talking points by now. But I've loved being able to showcase for people all of the kind of lesser known and subtler research going into things that are maybe not as directly related as, say, making a vaccine, but a more nuanced, like what are some of the economic issues that specifically related to the environment. So I would love if we could go into that a little bit first, if that's okay with you, and then get into some of the other stuff that you research.
Sure. Yeah, no problem. I mean, the research we were doing on the policy question was really honing in on just different trade-offs that happen if you're setting policy at the federal level versus the state levels, right? So if you're a federal agency, you're usually having to set these one-size-fits-all policies to kind of every state is doing similar things. And that could be because you don't have enough information to kind of tailor a policy to a specific area, or it could be because you're just worried about showing preferential treatment and some states get better deals than others and things like this. So there is this notion of fairness, or just you don't have enough information to do anything other than just set a one-size-fits-all policy. So obviously that doesn't work great. We kind of see this with COVID, right? Where policies that may look great for New York don't look so great to North Dakota or Idaho or somewhere else. So
Right.
there's that piece of it that sort of says, well, we should just decentralize everything, right? And have states manage everything, maybe even local public health departments do everything if that's the case, right? You take it to the extreme. But the other thing that pushes against that, obviously, is that, well, this stuff's spreading, right? It's moving from place to place, and places where it's moving are going to be somewhat determined by economic patterns and what states trade with who. And so an individual county or an individual state, there's a huge amount of the risk and the damages that come from a disease that they don't pay any attention to, right? Because it's spreading outside their own population.
Yeah.
So you get this kind of we refer to it as a weak link public good. So there's this notion of public goods where these things that you can't be excluded from taking advantage of it, but you also don't have to pay for it. And a weak link public good is taking that to the extreme and basically saying that this public good only gets provided if everybody contributes and pitches in, right? And so you can have a number of states that are doing all they can to kind of control the spread of this disease. But if one state just decides to, buck the trend and do nothing, then those folks can spread into the neighboring states and kind of basically undermine all the investments they made in public health in those states. So
not to mention if a bunch of people fly to a given area specifically because they say have a total there's no mandates, total freedom to do whatever they want or whatever, and then they fly back home to the places that have been doing everything that they can to mitigate spread. You can see how, and that's the sort of stuff that doesn't get tracked very thoroughly either, and is really difficult to get a handle on just how much that is happening.
Yeah, and there's an analogy to that in this pollution literature. They call it a race to the bottom, basically, which is this idea that states are going to start competing for more lax environmental regulations because they want to attract businesses to their state or whatever it might be, right? So you can see the same type of thing happening with COVID restrictions now, right? It's like, well, you want to go on vacation? You can do whatever you want here. Come on, right?
Yeah.
And so they get that short-term boost to the economy, and then they're exporting basically the disease back to whatever state they were in, right?
Right. It's also so hard with, say you're, because a lot of times it's not, they're not plotting. It's not the intention to go spreading a bunch of disease around the country because you believe in whatever this and that freedom and want to open your doors or whatever. But there's so many things like that. Like if you're a farmer up north, and even if the fertilizer that's getting into the Mississippi might be, getting into the Gulf and impacting the fishermen there and everything like that, you might go like, yeah, but how much is like my little bit of fertilizer actually doing? And you aren't a farmer, you aren't a fisherman in the Gulf, so it's not as costly to you. You're not being directly as impacted by it. There's just so many things like that within environmental issues.
Right. Yeah, it shows up a lot. I mean, it shows up in pollution. It shows up in endangered species protection, where I might do a lot for my own parcel or my own land to try to take care of an endangered species, but if someone else doesn't, then it sort of all falls apart too. So yeah, these things show up in a lot of different places. We weren't the first to kind of point them out. But we were basically just trying to pair those off and say, okay, well, that goes on if you just allow the states to do everything. You get no coordination. You get people flying all over the place to take advantage of lax standards and then ship stuff back. So there's some middle ground in between, right? The feds are going to basically account for all that, right? If you let the federal government do it, they will account for all that stuff, but they may not be able to tailor a policy exactly to the specifics of the state. And there's that trade-off between the states having kind of the ability to do whatever that makes sense for them versus the feds being able to kind of coordinate all the states toward a similar type of goal, if you can come up with a goal, right?
This just happens in so many things. I had hopefully his name comes to me. University of Wichita. Come on, subconscious, make it pop out. But I had someone on not too long ago, a repeat guest. Definitely remember his name. Anyway, did fascinating research with training police and building better simulators and figuring out like, okay, when a person moves their hip this way, it means this. Like this is the thing you wouldn't think you should pay attention to when worrying about being shot at or something. But actually, if you look at someone's knee movement instead of their eye movement or whatever. Anyway, one of the interesting takeaways from it was that there's no standardized anything like anywhere in the country. And it seems completely insane to just let every local police department train their own people. But then, of course, you can make a case that, well, who knows the actual local terrain better than the local police department is. So there's certainly things, and yes, the science of how to train, when you know someone's going to be shooting, it might be something that you'd federally mandate, but then you want to leave some room up to the local departments to figure out their, what's best for their communities.
Right. And in the disease case, you can kind of figure out some of this stuff by working with the epidemiologists. Because if you know kind of how fast or how contagious the disease is, you can get some indication of how fast and rapidly it's going to move across state boundaries. And then if you know something about kind of where people are traveling for work or business or what have you, you can get some sort of indication about the degree to which a state may be missing spillover effects that are occurring in other states. But the same general idea, shows up in a lot of different places.
So yeah, what did some of your work with COVID reveal?
Just that it's hard.
Yeah.
So it's hard to figure out exactly where to set these things. Like I said, it kind of comes down to what policies you're talking about, right? Because obviously a policy to shut down a border changes this whole discussion versus a vaccination policy. And so at the same time, if you have a very contagious disease, that's different than a disease that requires, direct physical licking or whatever to kind of get it spread, right? So all those things sort of fit into this and kind of paint a picture of where you are in terms of, for this particular policy, for this type of disease, these types of policies should be focused at the state level, and then these types of policies should probably be left to the feds. But there is the whole notion that all policies would go to one or the other is sort of the wrong way of thinking about it, right? There's just clearly some policies that the state should handle, and then there's others that the feds should handle. And so part of that was just kind of parsing it out and thinking through what should be handled and what in different locations.
What are the sort of considerations you need to make in terms of how these things will be received by the public? Because there's things that, okay, say take something like condoms. You go, okay, we've researched this. Condoms are exceptionally effective. And so we're this state in like North Dakota, whatever random state, we've decided we're going to mandate if you have intercourse outside of marriage or whatever, that you need to wear a condom. I would guess that condom use might potentially drop because people have an adverse reaction to being told what to do and to mandates, even though there's an objective reality that the effectiveness is there. But in terms of the public communication, some of these ideas of mandates can really backfire. And I think we've seen that with, some of the messaging with masks and distancing, and maybe there was no better way of doing it ever, and lots of people were just going to be in denial or want to live in their own reality and whatever else. But how do you make considerations like that when it comes to these environmental issues and everything else?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, because a lot of the policies that we were considering in that paper, their effectiveness is not clear. There may be scientific information that gives you some idea about how well it works, but people may discount that, or they may not be aware of it. And so the uncertainty piece of that one was a big thing that we left out, but it's something that a lot of my research kind of centers around, which is kind of how do people make these decisions about in the face of risk and uncertainty. And so with all this stuff, that's certainly the case, right? Is that you have some sort of policy that you don't know exactly how well it's going to work. And how basically do people respond to that uncertainty? Economists have all sorts of models, right, for how people make decisions under uncertainty. But I'd say it's one of the places where economists struggle a lot is to figure out how people do, because decisions under uncertainty, people just do weird things, right? I mean, they can either ignore the information and say, well, your objective information means nothing to me, and I'm going to discount it and do something completely different.
Right.
But then there's also weird stuff that people start to do when you start to get into stuff like epidemics, which we would think of as kind of low probability, high severity events, right? So there's a very low probability that I'm going to catch COVID and die, right? Mm-hmm. But it's a low probability, high severity, right? And you can basically group everybody in society into one of two camps. You either think about the low probability and you hone in on that and you say, I'm not going to worry about it, there's a low probability. Or you focus on the huge severity and you completely freak out and panic, right? So, and you think you can see everybody in society right now is falling into one of those two camps with COVID, right?
Yeah.
So we have models to try to figure out how people respond to these probabilistic events where you don't know exactly what's going to happen. But as the probability starts to go towards zero and that severity blows up, our models just don't do a great job of processing how people respond to those uncertainties.
I mean, I love behavioral economics stuff so much of kind of because it's along the similar lines of what we're talking about, which is you can step back and look at some, do the calculations of what this ideal scenario would look like, and then hope that humans behave as rationally as your computer models do, but that's often not the case in the real world. It's interesting with things like COVID, and I would say it'd probably extend into a lot of these bigger issues of biodiversity loss and global warming and everything else. But especially something like a global pandemic where, whether they're admitting it or not, probably most people, at least in the beginning, were probably scared or feeling a loss of predictability and loss of control over a lot of things and in their life. And that's such a major stressor that sometimes, creating a mandate or something is that just adds to that feeling of a loss of control. Some people, like for me, I just traveled a bit and had to go through Vegas and LA and everything. And from someone in Wisconsin that where there's no mandates here, and I'm the only one that ever wears a mask in a gas station, that as far as I see, it was kind of a relief for me to see, like, oh, cool, they have mandates here. So when I do go indoors, I know everyone else is going to be wearing a mask and I appreciate that. But I also understand that I'm also a rebel, and I also understand mandates and laws hit everyone a little differently. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's certainly when you command things, right, it certainly changes how people perceive them. I mean, there's a whole lot more going on, obviously, with COVID, and there's economic literature that delves into conspiracy theories and why people believe them and things like this. And so all these things are kind of going on, but it certainly is one of these cases where once you start to add a little bit of unpredictability and a little bit of uncertainty, economists have a much harder time predicting what people will do in those situations.
Yeah. What are some of the similarities that you've noticed between the challenges of COVID and then just some of your other environmental work that you've been doing for longer?
Yeah. Probably just the degree to which there's such questioning of the actual data itself. I feel like in most of environmental applications, we don't have nearly as good a data as a lot of my other colleagues that study other types of economics, right? So I have labor economists in my department, for instance, that are studying labor markets, and they've got this treasure trove of data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that they can go tap anytime they want, right? And I'm doing research on endangered species, right? And I may have like a couple of years of species counts that an ecologist collected for me. I don't have a whole lot of data to work with, but the data we have, we try to use it as much as we can and squeeze every bit of information out of it. So it's been interesting to see how, even though we are sort of in some respects awash with data in the COVID story, it gets discounted. And there's such a disconnect between kind of what the data says and then what people perceptions are for one reason or another. So that's been one of the big differences between the two. But it's also a case where there's a lot more of kind of true uncertainty. So when we do this research, we think of kind of the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns, right? So there's the unknown unknowns are obviously the true uncertainties, right? So like you were talking about, April of 2020, COVID was a true unknown unknown, right? And the known unknowns are the things where we have some history, we have some data, we won't be able to predict it with any certainty, but we can put maybe a probability distribution on it and give us some notion about how well we are predicting this given that past data. So COVID is clearly, started off in that completely unknown category, and then it's gradually maybe transitioned into a world where we have a little bit of data that we can use. But there's probably a bit of a mind block between saying, oh, it's just an unknown thing, I have no data to base this off of, and then now you're telling me you have all this data that you've collected over the course of a year and you have such certainty about what we should do. It's sort of I'd say rarely have we had such an endeavor where we've collected so much information so quickly. And I think in a lot of cases, people are just having a hard time switching over from, we don't know, you're kind of making it up as you go, to now suddenly people are super well informed about things. So it certainly seems to be that notion of kind of switching over from a known unknown to an unknown unknown has been tricky for people.
What about in terms of some of your past work and in terms of communicating some of these issues to the public or businesses or people in the agriculture industry or whatever, where, I've been doing this podcast for about 8 years, and 6 years or whatever that I did this before COVID, I never had anyone, like angrily questioning every detail of even just putting out. I've weeded those people out now, so we're in a safe space. But it's if I had someone on that's researched giraffes or something like that, no one was ever like, this giraffe researcher doesn't know what they're talking about. I trust my gut when it comes to giraffes, and I know giraffes better than this person. No one was ever like, well, I found this rapper and 2 disgruntled scientists on Twitter that validate my giraffe perspective. So screw this giraffe research. I don't believe this scientific dogma. But COVID has just been kind of a nightmare. Honestly, it's been never have I seen so much denial, so much like anger of just trying to be like, hey, here's some information. Here's what they know so far. I thought this might be useful for you, and people just really not wanting to hear anything.
Yeah, there's always been this notion, I guess, that in the economics world that, the source of the uncertainty you're thinking of matters, right? So, I might think if I'm doing endangered species research, right, there might be uncertainty about, how people value a species. There could be uncertainty about, what will the population of that species be from year to year, because there could be a massive snowstorm that knocks a population back, and they could have a couple of good growing years, right? So those would all be uncertainties. You could have uncertainty over the price of whatever it might be if you're harvesting it, right? If it's like an endangered fish species or something. So there's all sorts of different sources of uncertainty. And there's always been this question that showed up in the economics literature a lot, but it's always kind of motivated me, which is, how do two people walk into the room basically and cite the same uncertainty as a reason for doing something and doing nothing, right? And people kind of will cite, well, we don't know enough yet, so we need to hold back and not do anything. And then other people will look at it and say, oh, we have huge uncertainty, and they kind of focus on worst case scenarios immediately, right? And say, we need to do something now. And it's interesting how that happens, right? And part of it has to do with this intersection between what we call uncertainty and irreversibility. So the classic case, right, is like, if you've got a ton of uncertainty, but you're doing something where you always get take backs, right? And you can always redo it. The uncertainty is not such a big deal, right? Because the uncertainty, you can basically just go through, observe what happens, and then you just adjust your behavior, right? And then likewise, the irreversibilities that you might have in your life aren't that big a deal if there's no uncertainty, because you basically just know exactly what's going to happen. You can walk right up to the edge of the line. So the analogy is like walking along a cliff in the fog, right? Cliff is a pretty big irreversibility if you fall off of it, and the fog is sort of your representation of uncertainty. But if you take away the fog, the cliff isn't that big a deal. And if you take away the cliff, then the fog isn't that big a deal, right? So a lot of what I've been doing of late is trying to figure out where are the irreversibilities, because it seems like the irreversibilities are causing people to think about uncertainty in a different way. So classic example, right? It might be if you're talking about climate change, for instance, if you think that the irreversibility is kind of tipping points in the climate, that's going to, basically cause the melting of the ice caps, and it's going to reverse the currents in the ocean, and we'll never be able to go back, then you're obviously going to look at the uncertainty and say, we better take this precautionary approach, and we better do something now, right? But if you look at the irreversibility as, and if we shift off of fossil fuels, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. It's going to completely change the economy, and we may never be able to go back to that old economy anymore. People are going to lose their jobs, and it's going to have these irreversible impacts on communities across. Well, then you look at the uncertainty a little bit differently, right? You need a higher burden of proof to get you over that. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, are people looking at different types of uncertainty when they're citing that uncertainty and saying we should or should not do something? Or is it that they're looking at the same uncertainty, but they're just motivated by different cliffs or different irreversibilities that may cause them to look at it differently?
That's fascinating. I'm very curious what your take is on this. This is such a big question. What your general take on kind of global warming is in terms of where you fall between. My guess is that you try to figure out a balanced approach between the two opposite ends of these two extremes, the fog and the cliff, and how does the lens through which you see it maybe differ from others?
I don't know that it's different. I mean, as economists, we spend all our time looking at trade-offs, right? So people will say, well, no, don't ask an economist, because they'll just say, well, on the one hand, and then they'll just say on the other hand, right? And it's really just the economist thinking through the trade-offs. But it makes us look indecisive, right? So,
but that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? Isn't this like what super forecasters do really well? Is they hem and haw and consider lots of. There's a lot of on the other hands.
On the other hand,
amongst the people that make the best predictions.
Yeah, it always gives you the chance to be right or a little less wrong. But on climate change, I think there's some basic some pretty basic arguments that would say, look, we need to do something right away. The question just becomes, what is it that we need to be doing? Economists in general are pretty are big proponents of carbon taxes. And this is kind of this idea that, what carbon is it's basically a cost of production that certain industries just don't have to pay. So when you burn fossil fuels and you emit carbon, that's a production cost that we're not forcing them to pay. And so the carbon tax basically just internalizes that cost, and then lets firms figure out how to respond to it, right? So economists have been big on this notion of carbon taxes for a long time, just kind of recognizing, look, if we want to tackle climate change, this is going to be the least cost way of doing it, right? It'll get us to that goal, whatever goal it may be that you want for climate. It'll get us there in the least cost way. And so I think most of the economy, we've gone back and forth about whether it should be, a carbon tax or whether you should do cap and trade or one of those policies. At this point, I think economists are just like, any of them will be better than doing nothing at this point.
Yeah.
Just our debating this for 20 years has sort of created this perception that there's a ton of uncertainty about this. And really economists just want to do something. Either one of them will be fine. Just let us debate these little trivialities about which one is best. But the carbon tax, I think, is coming out on top at this point. It's just the most clear-cut way of doing it. And then the notion of kind of taking the revenues that you get from the carbon tax and then cutting everybody a check makes it super appealing to potentially get something passed. So I don't. That's not necessarily my perception based on my research, but it is certainly the consensus that's emerging within the economics community.
Well, let me throw this at you. I like to kind of share the way in which I would think through a thing, mostly so someone smarter than me can correct me. That's most of what this show is about. So I'll share, and then you get to point out how wrong I am on many of the ways I'm thinking. So when it comes to something like a carbon tax, or even say something like a sin tax, like there is for cigarettes, is the idea that what I like about it is, and I have no idea if this would actually be the case, but I think that it gets down to the true cost. I think it's really hard for us as consumers and manufacturers to understand the true cost of something. You go to the gas pump and you're like, well, this week my gas is $3 a gallon. Last week my gas was $2.50 a gallon or something like that. But what you're not seeing is whatever military costs there may have been, whatever subsidies there may have been. There's a lot of hidden costs. The land that may have been, the oil spills that may have happened, that and a potential something like a carbon tax or a sin tax would, in an ideal, if done right, kind of potentially make us a little more mindful to what the actual cost is, besides just the kind of short-term economic, here's what this costs in dollars. Am I thinking about that in a...
No, that's it. I mean, it's basically, economists, I think the economic way of thinking is, I don't necessarily want to ban anything. I just want people to face the true cost of whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And then people can decide basically at that point how much of, if they still want to go out and buy a muscle car and drive that, if they're paying the full cost of burning the gasoline, then I don't care. That's fine, right? I don't know how much you value driving that Dodge Charger. You may really love driving it, so I don't want to ban that. I just want you to pay the full cost of it, and then if you still choose to pay that price to go do whatever it is that you want to do, then that's fine.
Yeah, to me, it just seems like more of an honest. It's conveying the information in a more honest way, and to hopefully lead to more informed decisions. Whether you whatever you do with that information is kind of maybe besides the point a little bit. But I mean, I think taxes, laws, mandates, those things are all like kind of dirty words, and you can understand how no one likes being told what to do. No one wants to see that sign at the gas station go up. Everyone would like it to be as low as possible, but sometimes that's it. You know, what you're getting at the gas pump is a little bit like hey, join Apple TV. It's free for the first 3 months or whatever. It's like, well, that's maybe not the true cost. It's not really showing all of the terms and conditions and factoring in not what happens when after that 3 months or whatever else. And that's what kind of providing some of the true costs through the use of regulatory practices or cap and trade or syntaxes and those sorts of things does to me. To me, it's always seemed like a good idea to me. But I'm not the one that has to implement it. I wouldn't know how. So what do I know? But it's philosophically, it seemed like the right way to go.
Yeah. No, I think, yeah. Well, then you should have been an economist, I guess, because it sounds like you're on board.
So what are you, what kind of research are you working on at the moment? What is actually, I have to apologize because I actually did a bit of research for this interview like 3 weeks ago or something when we were supposed to record, and we just got rescheduled. No. Totally fine. I should have done a refresher, but I think you've mentioned endangered species a few times, and that's pinging me as like, oh, you do some work with endangered species and also evaluating some of the cost benefit analysis. I'm very interested in, and excuse me if this isn't your area, but in how species end up on that list of when they get taken off. Because there's probably a cost involved just putting a species on the list too, right?
Yeah, no, there's a big cost with getting the species on the list. I mean, I don't have the current numbers, but I mean, it can cost anywhere from $100,000 to millions of dollars to do all of the paperwork and litigation that's needed to go in, creating the research that needed to go in and the reports to get these things listed. So it's not exactly costless just to put them on the list. So there's a big cost to that. I mean, you ask what determines whether they go on there. I mean, technically, it's supposed to be based on scientific information only, right? There's no economic considerations that come into this. But I've had some colleagues at the University of Colorado or University of California, Davis that have looked at kind of what's driving those decisions. And there's little signals in there that economics is economic considerations are kind of filtering in there to some extent. So for instance, I mean, the vertebrate species are far more likely to be listed than invertebrate species or plants. And it's not because they're more endangered, right? It's just because people get warm fuzzies out of seeing they're cute, right? So we put them on there. I don't need that lichen on there, right? I don't need another type of whatever fern it is, right? But yeah, they definitely, people prefer the vertebrate species, and so they show up a lot more.
I get it.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not, when I'm scrolling through Instagram, I'm stopping on the cute animal videos way more often than I am the plant pictures. I do both, but but there's an intuitive feeling.
It was interesting. So I'll point out the researcher that has been doing some of this work. Her name is Fran Moore. She's at UC Davis. But what they did was they went through and they were looking to see if the names of these species were showing up in books. So they had done this text analysis to see if either the common name of the species or the scientific name were mentioned in books, with the idea being that species that get discussed in books more often are probably more front of mind for people. And there was some like weak evidence that like the degree to which a species shows up in literature even is correlated to some extent with how likely it is to get on the endangered species list.
So it's a familiarity.
It's a yeah.
People don't want to lose the thing they're familiar with. If it's the thing they're unfamiliar with, they don't care as much about it. What about the names themselves? What if you call something like the joy fern or something? Does that? I don't want to lose the joy fern.
We should think about that. Actually, they've been trying to do this with invasive species. So we've also been doing work on Asian carp that are in the Tennessee River, and they're in the Mississippi River. They grow super fast, right? So, but they're an invasive species here, but they're a delicacy in China. And so we've been trying to figure out how to rebrand them and make people like them more and maybe want to eat them and things. And so obviously carp, you don't want to go, I don't want the fried carp platter, so you got to figure out how to rename it. So they've experimented with different names to try to get people to eat these things. But I mean, this is getting kind of back to the behavioral economics stuff and even a little bit of marketing literature that kind of talks about how people perceive these things and whether you can rename them and get them to change how they look at it. So you could do the same thing for endangered species too. Yeah.
Well, it's so interesting because I've probably shared a couple times of lobster. It used to be something that was so abundant in New England that they would serve it to prisoners, and it was just this trash, cheap food that you'd give to prisoners, and prisoners would revolt because they were being fed so much lobster and nothing else. They just couldn't handle it anymore. And then you make it scarce, it becomes a delicacy. If there were only 100 carp left in the United States, I'm sure carp would become a delicacy in a hurry.
Yeah.
So there's factors like that.
There is some research where they've shown, right, that people prefer to eat and hunt stuff the more endangered they know it is, which is just, it's sort of feeding into your point there.
There's the, what is it? The 𝕊𝕐𝕐𝕚 or whatever. Shoot. Why can't I think of any names today? My last One Health guest. Oh my goodness. I'm just going to look it up. Pangolin. Oh, is it the pangolin that recently went on the endangered species? Anyway, I asked him what his favorite bushmeat foods had been, and he said he felt bad to say this, but the pangolin was one of the most delicious things he's ever tasted. And there's something about I really want to try pangolin. I feel ethically wrong for saying that. Adam Wilcox was on, and but yeah, there's something in me that I want to taste pangolin now. But it's such a messy world that we live in. Being a human is such a complicated thing, especially in a modern world. I mean, you can hardly blame the average person for not having the energy or not wanting to consider all of these insanely complicated variables that we haven't evolved to consider. We haven't evolved. Climate change isn't a thing that you feel. It's something that you discover through our modern tool use and scientific methods. It's not something that you feel like temperature. Biodiversity loss that happens over decades or something. It doesn't. You just don't feel it. You might go around your hometown and go, man, this has sure changed a lot in the 40 years that I've been on this planet or whatever. But you don't feel that on a day-to-day level. And the way in which human impacts are dramatically changing things from objective, looking at trends over decades sort of thing is horrifying. But on the day to day, it's hard to feel it,
Yeah, it is. It's hard to feel it. And then to some extent, you get the impression that people are maybe making financial decisions that aren't completely connected to what they're saying, right? So There's, we've done a couple of different projects looking at adoption of more water efficient irrigation technologies in California, right? So we'll go through and we'll basically say, here's how people have been adopting these technologies. Should they have adopted them if they didn't think climate change was happening? And the answer is almost always no, right? You would need to believe climate change is happening to kind of justify some of these investments they're making in more efficient irrigation. But then at the same time, you can go do a public opinion survey and people will say they don't believe in it, right? And it's sort of easy to kind of say, I'm questioning, but and a lot of times, especially for these kind of larger investments where you have to make this big irreversible decision about how much to invest in something, you tend to maybe stick a little closer to believing the data in some of these circumstances. But it certainly is, I think some people have shown similar stuff of buying and selling real estate in Florida, right? People will say they're not worried about climate change, but then real estate prices along the coast will signal otherwise. And so markets markets are signaling kind of what people probably truly believe when they have skin in the game, right? And surveys are sort of just signaling what people say they believe when there is no real skin in the game.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, that's every day of my life is what I say I'm going to do and what ends up happening are two very different things.
Yeah.
Well, going back to endangered species, I guess what would you like? Two questions, two pretty big questions. One, what would you like the public to understand more in terms of when thinking about endangered species, or when they see the next call to action to save this and that? And because there's also, obviously there's bias when like everyone needs to protect the bald eagle when you're American and that's your national bird, and
right.
and maybe not so much. You don't care about the species that isn't on, associated with your country or state or whatever. So I'd love to know what you wished the public knew more about, because this is a big part of the One Health initiative, is just getting some more of this information and knowledge out to the public. And then after that, or before that, any way that you want to answer this is fine. I'd love to know what your take is and what some of the issues with the endangered species list, and if you had a little more influence on whatever board or whatever is associated with this, what you would maybe recommend in terms of policy change.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. I think a lot of people have pointed this out, but the Endangered Species Act is really more about habitat than it is the species itself. So it's unlikely, that if a species goes extinct, that people that were advocating for the protection of that species would be like, oh, okay, we don't need this habitat anymore. You can bulldoze it and turn it into whatever you want, right? You're wanting to protect both the species and the habitat. And so one of the things that has been promoted, other people have said this, but I just think it's a good idea, is that it should be more focused on habitat than it is species. It's not necessarily the species. In order to protect the species, you obviously have to protect the habitat. But by focusing more on habitat, then you'd kind of be recognizing where habitat is serving dual purposes and protecting multiple species. And you'd be focusing more on the connections of kind of humans to this species, right? That they're really, humans are interacting with this species through the habitat. So that's sort of just a conceptual refocusing off of, and I'm not saying there should be like an endangered habitats list or something like that, but that's sort of kind of the idea, is let's take the focus off of the species itself and get away from kind of counting species and things like this and focus more on preserving habitat. And then if you do that really well, then the rest of the species preservation will come, right? So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing to recognize is that it is insanely costly to get these things listed and to have them on the endangered species list. We'd be far better off if we could just keep them off the list to begin with. and we know this, there's a huge backlog of species that are technically meet the criteria for listing, but the Fish and Wildlife Service that administers the Endangered Species Act has just decided that they're not a high priority. And so there's a huge backlog of things that we know we should be protecting, but we just don't have the funds to protect it. And so it would just be far better to not wait until these things get so far gone that they could make the list, and to try to figure out policies that would prevent them from getting in such bad shape to begin with. We were talking this past month here in Tennessee. The big news was that the snail darter was getting off the endangered species list, and the snail darter was kind of the big first test case for kind of how are people going to react to the endangered species list, right? I mean, it's almost like any environmental policy, right? When Congress writes it up, it's we're going to combat this environmental degradation at any cost at all. That's how the legislation is sort of written. And then they hand it over to the EPA, or they hand it over to the Department of Energy, or whoever it is. And then they're the ones who have to figure out how to make this work, right? And so it's sort of like that with the Endangered Species Act. When you read the legislation, it's we're going to protect species at all costs. And then, of course, you go on and people start to, oh, how serious were we about that all cost thing, right? And so then that starts to become the debate that moves forward. So the snail darter was kind of the first test case for this. There was a big dam that was supposed to be built on the Little Tennessee River here in East Tennessee, and the whole project was almost complete. And then they found this the snail darter that was living in this stream that it was the only other place they'd found it in the world, and they put it on the endangered species list to try to stop this dam project. And there was a huge debate back and forth about this thing. And finally, the dam project went ahead anyway, even though the snail darter was on the endangered species list. But that was I'm going to mess up the dates, mid-70s, that it was put on the list, and it was just delisted. Actually, it's just proposed for delisting. It hasn't been delisted yet. So I mean, it's taken a long time to get this thing off the list and to kind of do all the work that it takes to build these places back up. So it would be far better to just keep these things from reaching the brink of getting on the list to begin with. Part of what it has taken, I think, is the firms, the companies, the businesses that are developing these habitats are now recognizing that, hey, it's a huge cost if we have something that gets listed. Like if you're an oil and gas company operating in Oklahoma, and you're worried that there's a species that's on your property that might get listed, that might, limit how much you can do drilling for oil and gas, you have a pretty big incentive to try to make sure that you can create habitat and get those species numbers back up and prove to the Fish and Wildlife Service that this thing is not as endangered as they thought, right? So previously it was sort of this shoot, shovel, and shut up story where firms would just try to hide the fact that they had these endangered species, or maybe kill them off before anyone caught them there. And now I think firms in some cases are starting to realize, hey, look, if we do get caught with this thing, it's really going to be costly. Let's try to do some initial efforts to keep the population up and not on the endangered species list.
That seems more reasonable to me. That seems like progress.
It's just taken 30 years for them to realize that that's the smarter way to go, right?
Yeah. Well, what is your take on, because I like this habitat perspective. And through that lens, does that mean that, when thinking about something like an endangered species, you're more thinking about things like keystone species, or both keystone species that are essential for the environment, and then kind of I guess the more harmful invasive species? Because I imagine there's plenty of invasive species that probably don't harm the habitat that much. It's just ones that kind of break through, and but then at the same time, there's all sorts of, like, say the bee population, even without it going extinct, if there's a dramatic hit to it, that's going to be a lot more costly for the habitat, even if even if bees are still far from extinction. Do you know what I'm saying with that? I guess I'm curious how much you would. So when the endangered species list as it is right now has, you'll see like, oh my gosh, there's only like 80 of these rhinos left or something like that. I think in a habitat model, you would kind of award more points or something depending on how much of an impact a given species has on the environment.
I would think of it more as you would focus on habitats that you think are endangered. And then if you basically preserve the habitat, then these species will come back on their own.
I see.
Right? So I think you almost take the whole species notion out of it, right? Every habitat will have, food webs that have developed because of a healthy habitat, right? And if the habitat is unhealthy, then those food webs basically get trimmed to some extent, and species kind of drop down, and maybe the food chain gets a little more funneled. But if the habitat is healthy, then those things would kind of naturally kind of build out the species that were already potentially there. Now, invasive species sort of change that a bit, right? Because you could be preserving the habitat itself, and then just leaving yourself more susceptible to endangered species coming in, right? If an endangered species is more invasive in a pristine habitat versus a disturbed habitat. And there are cases where invasive species, some invasive species do really well when you have disturbed habitat, and others do really well where you have natural pristine habitat. So the invasive species sort of makes the habitat model, adds some nuance to the habitat model, I guess. But I think the natural way of thinking about it would just be, let's just identify habitats that we think are endangered. There may be some consideration of the species that live on those habitats, obviously, if that's part of the reason that you're concerned about them. But it wouldn't necessarily be these goals of saying, I've got 80 rhinos and I need them to go to 200 before I'll feel better about it, right? It's more of a, make the habitat healthy, and then the rhino population will recover naturally on its own, provided you haven't driven it to a breaking point already.
So how do you go about forming a habitat-centric policy when, because one of the things about the endangered, one of the things about a species-oriented perspective is, I feel like it's just easy. The calculations are easier, if there's 60 rhinos and 30 rhinos, or then 500, you can measure success really like quite clearly. If you've decided this is how we measure success, it's the number of rhinos that exist on Earth. Whereas a habitat, things get very messy. I love the messiness of it. This is why I love the One Health initiative so much, is because it factors in so much of the complication and trying to figure out the organized chaos that we live in, and how to manage it and create effective policies and raise awareness and everything. But do you know what I'm saying? How do you go about creating habitat specific policy?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I don't have the answer on that one. Obviously it is easier to kind of set goals and determine whether you've succeeded when you're focusing on population numbers. So I guess in that respect, it's easier. I guess the downside, of course, is that if you don't understand the interactions between the habitat and the species, then you may not be able to figure out exactly what you need to do to get it over that hump, right? If you think that all I need to do basically is just preserve this thing where the rhino lives right now, but it actually could survive over here, and it actually may need to move if climate change is happening and driving and drying up its water source or what have you. I think that gives you more of a perspective that, these things will probably work because they're helping preserve the habitat, and maybe looking forward to see where habitat will be in a few years. Whereas these things are just trying to, boost a number, or maybe prevent prevent more harvesting and things like this that are more number centric on the population itself. I think the big reason that people have sort of started moving to this habitat question was that recognition that species ranges are shifting, right? So if we know climate change is moving where these species can exist, there's shifting migration patterns and things like this. And so the real fear was, well, shoot, if we list this thing now and we designate a whole bunch of critical habitat when we list this thing and we say, okay, we've got to protect these areas. We spend a ton of money on protecting those areas. And then it turns out that in 10 years' time, this species has migrated somewhere else, and those investments are no longer any good. That hopefully maybe this habitat perspective could kind of guide you in thinking about those types of considerations a little more than just saying, well, this thing is here right now. Let's just save what we've got where it's at right now.
And I feel like the habitat perspective also just is further reaching. It's more inclusive of so many other considerations in terms of what pipeline is coming through a given area, what should be considered a national park, what should be available for real estate, where can you drill, that sort of a lot. It includes a lot more factors than just a species perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're hitting the nail on the head. I mean, when you do the listing decision, right, it's all about numbers. It's all about the population of the species. It's all about the numbers, right? But then when you actually have to go and do these management plans to rehabilitate the species that's all about the habitat, right? So it's almost like you're making a decision about what goes on the list based on populations. But then when you turn your attention after it's listed to what are the things we're actually going to do to bring the species back up, it's all about habitat, right? And so there's some fear that if you're basically setting an objective when you put something on the list, and you're setting an objective based on this metric, which is the population, but then you're pulling all the levers over here based on habitat, that these things might not be the most efficient way of getting these things off the list, right?
So I have some really good news for you, which is all of Congress has started listening to this show. They're listening to this episode specifically. You know,
Great.
They had a realization, you know, they're like, oh man, we've been doing this all wrong. We've been putting all of our effort into going around giving pep talks in various regions and these cheesy campaign speeches and stuff. And what if we instead just did a really good job, and then people saw that and would elect based on that, and they're like, oh my goodness, we need to know more about the environment and protecting habitats and economics influence in that. So now that you have their ear, what's some things that you would like to see from policymakers' perspective? Some things that, like, information that you'd like to see to get through some new considerations being made
with respect to endangered species, or in general?
Just generally, yeah, in general, with your work, because we all have a different lens based on our the things that inform us and the things that are that we care most about, and so I'm sure that you have a different lens through which, when you're reading the newspaper and everything, you shake your head or celebrate different things.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I think as the kind of the economic way of thinking we've already talked about, it's just trying to get these markets correct, right? What does that mean? Economists have a pretty good definition of what that means. But it was like we were talking about earlier with climate change, is like making sure that the price of these things is reflecting the true cost of using them, right? Or if it's a benefit, right, it's kind of making sure that the habitat you're protecting, that the value of that land is actually reflecting the true benefit that it provides to society, right? If you're owning ranch land in North Dakota, the market price may signal a different benefit than what it might be for habitat preservation, right? So I think it's really just we should be spending more time trying to make sure we have the markets right. And if it takes a tax to fix the market, then tax isn't such a bad thing, right? A tax is just trying to make the markets work more efficiently. And I think most people that don't like taxes are also usually pretty free market economics. So that's essentially what it's doing. It's just trying to just make these markets work more efficiently. I think once you get those things kind of locked down and nailed away, you realize how little of this other regulation you need. And so, this is one of the issues with the carbon tax issue that they're talking about is if you could impose this carbon tax, there would be a lot of current climate policies that are on the books that you would no longer need. Because the whole purpose is that the carbon tax would be creating those incentives that were originally created by like a renewable fuels mandate or something. It would be creating those incentives, but it would just be doing it a lot cheaper. And so you're getting to the same point at a lower price. You don't need both of these policies. Let's just use the one that's going to get us to avoiding 1 degree Celsius temperature increase at the lower price tag. So I think most of what I talk to, and I do a bit of talking to folks, to politicians in my role here at the Baker Center. But a lot of what I'm trying to get across is that a lot of these things that you think are dirty words that are taxes or cap and trade and things like this, these are really just economists' attempt to try to make these markets work better. So if you like free markets, then you should be a little more supportive of those types of efforts. And that's just true of any environment, right? I mean, I think as an environmental economist, we're always trying to use the market to fix the environment. I mean, that's kind of the basic thing environmental economists try to do. Just because we see the market as a more efficient and less costly way of trying to achieve whatever environmental goal you want to achieve, right? So I can sit in a room full of ecologists and hydrologists and epidemiologists, and we can all come up with a goal. And then it's sort of my job at the end of the day to say, okay, here's the goal we wanted. Let's just try to get there for the least prices possible, right? I'd like to pay the lowest amount I possibly can to achieve that goal, and I don't want to pay more than I have to. So I think that's just in general the economic way of thinking that would be that I'm usually trying to espouse when I'm talking to people about policy in general, is that mindset and that way of thinking about things.
Well, that's an interesting consideration. That's a heck of a selling point that I think most people would get down with, which is the idea of, hey, if we put this one policy in place, whether you like policy or not, that might mean that this one policy negates the need for other policies. So yes, we're adding a policy here, but you're also losing, you're gaining freedoms in other ways. Right.
And then the whole debate about the carbon tax is really turned since there was more discussion about using those tax revenues to provide rebate checks to people. So for the longest time, right, it was a true tax. It just went to the general coffers and the federal government got to spend it however they wanted. But when you ask people, and they've done surveys on this, right, they're like, how much are you supportive of a carbon tax? I hate it. Tax, no, bad, don't like it. What about a carbon tax where we'll take the revenues and then we'll send you a check for $100 every month? They're like, oh, well, that's better. Yeah, I can get behind that, because it's really no longer a tax at that point. You're basically just collecting a pool of money and then redistributing it to people.
Yeah.
So that one gets a lot more support once you start to talk about it like less like a tax and more like a dividend check, right? Basically, the economy is going to generate some carbon and that's going to cause a harm. And so now society as a whole is going to take advantage of kind of the carbon reduction benefits instead of maybe a few companies or something.
That's well, I love the idea of finding things that at first glance might seem like a cost, but there's actually a lot of downstream benefits to doing it, and you could see this in a lot of environmental, say, state park protections or something like that, where it might seem costly, it might seem like a cost to preserve all of this land, but potentially you're getting tourism. You're getting tourism money that is better than like selling off the land for someone's property or something. I'm losing my words here, but do you know what I'm trying to say? What are some of the? I'm really curious about some of the low kind of initial cost things that would, from your perspective, lead to some of the bigger downstream benefits for everyone.
I mean, it would have to be those carbon taxes. I mean, I hate to keep beating a dead horse here, but we've just been studying those for so long that we have a pretty good handle on what those would look like and what they would do. I'd say better than any other policy that environmental economists have been pushing for the longest time.
And what are the major hurdles in getting that passed?
That's a good question. At this point, I'm not sure. I think it's just that it's become a political issue. And so people have just seen climate itself has turned into a political issue. So I think for the longest time, there was legitimate questions about how well these things would work, what might be the implications of them. And I think we have a much better handle on that now after 30 or 40 years of working through this stuff. And now it just feels like it's much more of a political hurdle that's left to get over on that front. Now, there's other places where that type of approach we still don't understand very well. And that's sort of the whole idea behind the One Health thing, right? Is that, well, as an economist, I want to get at the true cost and the true benefits of these things. But as you were saying, as One Health points out, these things are all connected. It's super complicated. So in a lot of cases, in order for me to get the true cost and the true benefits, I can't just do it on my own. I got to understand how these other systems work and work with other natural scientists and physical scientists to figure this out. But in those cases, that's where, you could say that more work needs to be done to kind of figure out exactly how these things fit together. But the carbon one is the one that we've been studying now for the longest time. And it's the low hanging fruit that I think almost any economist that you'd survey, 99.9% are going to say, yeah, we just need carbon tax.
I'm also curious of some of the other benefits that might come from that. I remember over a decade ago reading this book from this guy, Ray Anderson, who is no longer alive, but he was a carpet manufacturer that had this big environmental epiphany and realized he only had so much time left and really bought into the idea of being more environmentally conscious and sustainable. But through that, he took things that to reduce waste and everything else that ended up actually creating him more profit in the long run through creating more sustainable ways of doing things and eliminating waste within his industry. And I wonder how much a carbon tax would do something similar, where there are things that a lot of companies could would maybe jump over to a different way of doing things if the cost incentive was they're like maybe on the fence of taking the initiative toward a new innovation anyway. It's just right now the cost of initiating that doesn't make sense, whereas something like a carbon tax might be the catalyst for some kind of green innovation and that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the idea, right? Is that there'd be all these little improvements that could be made along the way, from switching a fuel source or making a certain process more efficient so that you don't need as much fuel. There'd be all these little tweaks along the way that these firms would now have the incentive to do, right? And the whole idea is that they probably know better about where to make those improvements. So your guy at the carpet manufacturer probably knows much more about that process and can figure out where those efficiencies should come from, rather than an official at the EPA, right? So if you take the regulatory approach, you're saying EPA official gets to decide how it is you're going to achieve your emissions reduction. Whereas with a carbon tax, you're basically saying, here, you figure it out. You know your process better than anyone else. The carbon tax is basically the reward for you finding these efficiencies, but we think you can probably find them better than we can. And so that in and of itself is what makes this carbon tax approach so the price tag on it is so much smaller. It's just a much more efficient way because you're leveraging people's knowledge of their own production processes and the inputs they're using and things like this to figure out what are the low hanging fruit in terms of reducing carbon emissions. And that's true for almost any pollutant that you would be looking at.
Yeah. And that's the advantage of decentralizing those sorts of decisions.
Yeah. I mean, you've in some ways you've kind of set a collective decision, right? I mean, as we as society have decided that we want to achieve some emissions reduction goal. And so that sort of sets what the tax is, right? But then after we as society have decided what the goal is and how high the tax needs to be to achieve that goal, then, you know, implementing the tax is basically how you get that done at the least cost. So yeah, it's sort of like saying we have a collective goal and then we're going to leverage this decentralized process to kind of do this in the most efficient way possible.
So coming full circle after everything that we've discussed and going back to the beginning of talking about, and you're touching on this now, of but we talked about the kind of difference between the state and the federal level. How do you do something like a carbon tax if in any other way other than at the federal level? And because how otherwise there's going to be the race to the bottom, the state that decides that they're not going to use the carbon tax or whatever, and businesses will move there to not have to pay the carbon tax. And then on an international level, if your country has restrictive enough policies, what's to stop people from outsourcing to other countries with less restrictive policies? How do you manage that mess?
Yeah.
And you have in 30 seconds or less.
In 30 seconds or less. Easy. I mean, the international thing is hard, but it comes down to basically setting what they call border adjustments, right? So if I import something from you and you don't have any carbon emissions policies in your place, in your country, then I might impose an import tariff, which is basically just an import tax based on the carbon content of whatever it is that I'm importing, right? So that basically says your country doesn't necessarily have a policy, but I'm going to basically make you pay for not engaging in these cleaner practices if you want to do trade with me as the United States or whatever it is. Now, that same thing doesn't go on at the sub-federal level, right? Because states can't impose tariffs on each other, right? Tennessee can't impose a tariff on Kentucky as much as it might want to. But so they can't do that at that level. But I think for the longest time, economists have thought, well, it's just better to not have these patchwork of different policies going on. We should just have the federal government just kind of set the stage and coordinate all this and let's get going. And I think of late, economists have started to recognize, you know, that may be true, but there's just so much there's so many things that have to fall into place politically for us to get a federal policy passed, that having the states set different carbon taxes or different cap and trade programs might not be all that bad. Kind of getting back to before, right? We may be getting fixated on these slight differences between a state policy lead or a federal policy lead, when in reality, it's just better to have somebody lead, right? So I think economists, you know, over the years, there's been a much bigger, especially over the past 4 to 6 years, a much bigger emphasis on states doing these policies. And so you see places like California that have cap and trade implemented, and you see Washington State having a vote about carbon taxes that are at the state level, that are only true for the state. And you may end up seeing more of that as time goes on, just because there seems to be such an impasse of getting things done at the federal level. It's that political stuff that the economists can tell you what makes sense, you know, economically, but if there's just political issues going on, then that may be the last hurdle that the economist hasn't figured out how to get over yet.
So then I guess maybe in kind of closing, and also make sure and throw in anything else that you want to say before we wrap up, but So what can people do, and what can be done from, I mean, I guess, obviously things like the One Health Initiative are trying to take initiative to get this information out to the public. And hopefully within doing that, that can be something where the public can then add to the considerations that they have when they're voting, what kind of policies they should be voting for, because hopefully it's a more informed public. So what can be done from kind of, I guess, the bottom up level of things, for any listener here that isn't just Congress listening in?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think you pointed this out earlier, is that there's just so much information for people to process at this point, right? And so I may be different than many other of my colleagues in the One Health Initiative and thinking that the fix to all this is just providing people with more information. Because I think people have already reached information overload at this point, right? I can't take anymore. I can't sit down and consider whatever it is you're wanting me to consider. Yeah. And so I may be a little more skeptical than some other of my colleagues about the degree to which we just need to tell people about this research that we're doing, and everybody will suddenly snap out of it, and they'll start paying attention and doing what's best for the environment. I'm much more of the science needs to go toward developing policies that will make it easier for people to do what's right. I mean, we're all just looking for signals, right? And I think prices is kind of the one I've harped on today is sort of the biggest signal, right? If you get the prices right, that's sending signals to people that they see every single day, right? But you say, I mean, you're into behavioral economics, that all that stuff is about nudges, right? It's these kind of invisible prices. If we can't change the prices per se, are there other things we can do that will kind of signal to people to do the right thing without them having to process a whole bunch of information and kind of like these rational economic robots that we think of them as. So, I mean, I guess, from an individual's perspective, I would really just like to get the policies right. And I know that's a vague statement, but from an economist's perspective, it means kind of getting those prices right, figuring out if the prices are wrong and we can't fix them for whatever reason. Can we send people nudges and signals where they don't have to think too hard and they don't have to process too much information that will just get them to behave better, right? The classic example is kind of sending people information about their neighbor's electricity bills, right? And if I know my neighbor is being more energy efficient than I am, it tends to cause me to be more energy efficient, right? So those little things, right? I think those are the things where people are just busy, they got a lot going on. Things like the One Health Initiative are telling people that it's more complicated than what they previously thought when they weren't paying attention. So I think it's sort of just using the information that we learned from these One Health efforts and other similar efforts to go into the policy. But I think it makes it tough when then everybody feels like, every policy then goes to a vote, right? Because you feel like you need to know everything about this one policy, whatever it may be. And so you need to get informed about that one policy. But from your day to day, you don't have to sit there and recalculate, what is the impact of burning gasoline today versus another day or what have you. So I guess I'm just a little, people getting involved is great. I would, as a busy person, it'd be a lot better if I could just get those signals sent to me in a very easy to process type of way. And prices is a good way to do it, but there are others too.
Yeah, that's an interesting that idea of seeing your neighbor's use of things, because as someone who I lack just conscientiousness generally. I'm a messy person. I don't put a lot of thought into. I spend a lot of my life on autopilot, and I'm not always the most environmentally mindful in my day to day, and so it's something like. I sometimes think about how much time I'm spending in the shower. Other times I don't, but if if I was getting something that was like, you are above average in your neighborhood and water consumption or something, that I think that would be an interesting cue. I think that's.
And it's not, it's not precise, right? It's just a simple signal that you can easily kind of process without thinking too much about it. And the people who knock this stuff will be like, well, we don't want everyone to turn into kind of calculating individuals, that everything I do, from opening the door to taking a shower, what temperature do I set my thermostat, everything doesn't have to be calculated. But if you're already concerned that, maybe there's an environmental signal that you're not getting from the markets, then some signal is better than no signal at all, for sure.
What are some things that has there been anything that you've gotten excited about environmentally from private industry that's been done without any policy whatsoever? I mean, when you talked about, we didn't even touch on coal plants that you mentioned in the beginning of the episode, but there are with things like solar or electric cars or something. It feels like once in a while, regardless of whether policy is happening or not, there's innovation that comes along where it's like, well, this is actually just much more efficient than coal is, or this is, it's kind of been that gradual. Fire was this nice source of energy, and then the humans have figured out more and more efficient ways of getting X units of power out of so much substance or whatever. And this has kind of been a natural progression without policy. So has there been anything that you've been excited about just from the private side of things?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think the decline in the cost of solar panels, right, is a big one. So there was lots of innovation that went into trying to reduce the cost of solar panels over the past decade. They've dropped a ton. And that was somewhat motivated by actual environmental pressure, but it was also motivated a lot by, I think, the thought that more environmental pressure was going to come in the future, either from regulators through policy, or people are just demanding this more. And so that I think people just saw early on that people are going to want this. They're going to want cleaner forms of energy down the road. And if we can corner the market now, then this would be a very good thing. So obviously that's one place where that's come up. And there's some notion, of course, for certain things that the innovations come when you have some sort of way of certifying those innovations. So, if you have, building material or buildings, for instance, right? Companies are choosing to go LEED platinum or whatever it is now, right? They're making lots of investments that they might not have otherwise made. And they're coming up with a lot of innovations that wouldn't have otherwise been made in order to get that LEED designation that they can put on the building and signal to people that this is a LEED building, right? I don't know that they're necessarily always doing that to save money, but they're doing it to kind of signal their intentions of trying to reduce energy usage or water usage or whatever it might be. There's a lot of cool stuff going on kind of green financing that I think is kind of neat, the way they've figured out how to create financial incentives for private companies to invest in different types of environmental preservation projects. It may have nothing to do with what they're doing, right? So it could be Chase Bank investing in habitat preservation in New York, right? It could be something like that. But those things where they've kind of figured out that, these things provide a return in some way, and it may be a low return, but it's a relatively low risk return. And so they've kind of figured out how to create these environmental assets in a way that firms are actually choosing to invest in them, even though they may get no direct benefit from their production process at all, right? It doesn't necessarily help them, but they're getting some sort of additional return. So carbon markets are a great way to think about this. So if if you get a carbon credit for owning forest in Montana, just by leaving the forest there, right, that becomes an additional asset that people are now investing in that have no consideration about using it for real estate or timber or whatever, right? It's just generating now carbon sequestration returns for that company. And so those things are cool, because that's obviously, those are places where if you create the incentive, then private companies will figure out where to come do these things and start investing in them on their own. So those types of things have been kind of cool. And those are kind of more broad things. Those aren't sort of one-off technologies or anything like that. But those have been places where I see there's still a lot of potential for sort of creating the right incentives for private companies to make these investments to try to offset any environmental harm that their production process may be creating that they can't reduce in another way, or that regulations may not force them to reduce.
So I keep on saying this is my last question, but regarding that, are there things in terms of ways in which there's incentive to signal for corporations? It just made me think about the idea of organic or natural or GMO free and all of these things that don't actually mean anything really, brass tacks, but it's this nice little signal that consumers go, ooh, that's natural, and I don't want an acronym in my food. So are there things like that are happening in terms of I guess corporations kind of false signaling things, finding little ways of putting this little stamp of, look how eco-friendly we are?
Yeah, I mean, that was where I was going to go, and I decided not to go down the organic food hole. But yeah, that's where all this started. Was that there were lots of firms that were putting organic or all natural or whatever it might be on their packaging, which means nothing, right? But people were paying a premium to get it, and so, of course, what that ends up doing is it creates a disincentive for farmers who are actually engaging in organic practices, right? Because they have no way to signal, hey, I'm doing this right. That guy over there just put organic on his box, right?
Exactly.
So, do you have these certifications? We've recognized now that there is now this desire by corporations to signal that they're green. The next step is to recognize that they can game the system, right? And then figuring out that, okay, these things that they're doing need to be certified by some third party to say that, hey, they are doing it, or it basically just squashes any incentive for anybody to actually correctly behave, right? So you see this now where you have like USDA has an organic certification. Oregon Tilth is another example of an organic certification that you have for food. They have similar certifications for timber that show that it's been raised in a sustainable level. And there's 3 or 4 different versions of timber certifications that promise to do different things, right? You'll see more things. You'll see more of that show up because these green measures are showing up in their their reports to stockholders, where stockholders are coming back to these companies and saying, we want to see more green, you doing more green activities. And they'll list them in there, but there's no one who's actually certifying that they're doing what they're doing. And so you'll see more of this because stockholders are going to demand, hey, we really want to know that we want this quantified. We don't want you to just say you went and bought some forest land in Montana and you're not showing us what it actually did. So you'll see more of that moving forward for sure. And you've already heard some rings from this from equity firms who are kind of specializing in being environmental equity firms, that they want to see more proof that these things that they're saying, firms are saying are green, are actually green. Yeah.
That's true cost and true benefit too. You want to know what you're buying.
Right.
I want the organic thing I'm buying to actually be organic. I don't want this technically isn't a cage when it's still just as bad as the cages or whatever else. So yeah, that's...
and to some extent, I'm just contradicting what I said before, because you basically have to get the customer and the consumer to recognize that these things are good, right? So it takes, decades of kind of educating people about these are the things that are actually environmentally sound practices that you should be demanding of these companies, right? It's not enough to just say that they slap organic on their label, or they say that it's some ingredient free when the ingredient was never really in there to begin with, right? So it's more than that. So there is some notion that you have to educate consumers to kind of know what it is that they're looking for those certification programs to work.
Well, this was a really fun conversation, Charles. Thanks so much for joining me. You were a great guest. I appreciate everything that you do. This was super fun. Do you want to say anything about the One Health initiative before we leave, just because they're the ones that put this together?
Yeah. So I just want to say thanks to all the people that are kind of organizing that initiative. It's been super fun to be a part of. It's one of those, and academia in general, right? We end up staying in these little silos and doing our own work. And the One Health initiative has been one of those really successful examples of where we've said, look, we can't solve any of these problems if everybody stays in their own silo. And we've got to figure out how to get people out of these silos and working together, even though in a lot of cases, people have an incentive to stay in their own silo and do their economic work and their ecological work and their epidemiology work, but it works best when it all goes together. So, this stuff is super important for kind of all those examples I mentioned before, getting the prices right and getting the policies right. So without these things, we have zero hope of getting any of those policies right moving forward.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you. Charles Sims is the guest. Everybody, thank you so much for listening and being such wonderful, curious people. And we'll talk with you next week.